Hello, everyone, and welcome to my introduction to this week's podcast edition of Listening to America. Richard Rhodes is one of the most extraordinary writers, thinkers, historians in America. He wrote one of the most important books of our time, The Making of the Atomic Bomb. But there are 27 others. He's an amazing man. He's become my friend. I'm going to be seeing him in Seattle during the phase 2 of my John Steinbeck Travels with Charlie tour. I saw something that he wrote, and so I wrote to him and asked him a couple of months ago, would you be willing to come on the program to have a series of conversations about America at 250? To my extraordinary satisfaction and surprise, he said yes immediately. And so this is the second of our conversations, and there'll be more. His range as a writer is remarkable. I had known about his work, of course, forever, but I was reading a set of his essays that go all the way back to the 1970s, and they were so well written. Essays are an interesting form. They need to have a little breathing space in them. They need to try out some ideas. That, in fact, is the technical meaning of essay, to try, to send up a trial balloon, in a sense. There has to be an essay style, and he has it. I mean, he was born to be an essayist, but he also wrote these 900 to 1,000-page books on the hydrogen bomb, on the atomic bomb, on the proliferation of nuclear weapons, and so on. So now we're having these conversations, and I just want you to have the sense of how amazing it is that a person of that stature, who has earned the right to be heard, whether we agree with him or not is neither here nor there. I mean, he has earned the right to be heard because of the extraordinary work that he has done in his career. And I'm just thrilled. Violence is something that's just entirely bewildering. How the most extraordinary republic in the world can routinely accept the level of gun violence in the United States. And of course, it's not just gun violence, but a gun changes the entire equation, of course. The rest of the world looks on us with perplexity. Why would a major nation tie itself so completely to an absolute interpretation of an amendment written in 1788 or 89? Why would a nation in the 21st century tie itself to an 18th century concept of firearms? I get it that the Second Amendment has a great validity in American law because the Founding Fathers deliberately articulated a certain number of rights that they felt that the government of the United States must not trample upon. Free speech, the right not to incriminate oneself, the right to trial by jury, a speedy jury, to be able to have counsel in a court of law, etc. And one of the amendments, the second, in fact, produces a very strong constitutional right to keep and bear arms. And just because we might think that gun violence is a horror, you can't just undo that. That would require probably a counter-constitutional amendment. It's hard to believe that that could pass. It's a very deeply embedded American legal right. And more than that, it's extremely deeply woven into the souls of millions of Americans. And I mean, when I meet people, as I do, who say, out of my cold, dead hands, they mean it. They believe that standing up for their Second Amendment rights to have essentially as many firearms as they might wish is the fundamental right of what it is to be an American, and that all other rights, in some sense, are guaranteed by my ownership of firearms. That's what they believe. And the Constitution seems to support them. So if we're going to get at the problem of violence in American life, we can't lead with guns. We have to lead with mental health. We have to lead with gun education. We have to lead with a change in the way we think about conflict resolution. In other words, there has to be a whole series of conversions of the way we see the world and the way we think. Anyway, it's fascinating. And this is the kind of person you want to be talking about because he has knowledge, evidence, data, and he's not a knee-jerk this or that. So it's now midsummer 2024. And later this week, I get back on the road for phase 2 of the great John Steinbeck Travels with Charlie tour. Today I had the most extraordinary day. I went with Nolan, my friend and videographer, and our friend Brian Jackson, up to Lake Sakakawea, about a 2.5-hour drive from here, near Twin Buttes. He brought his boat, and we took that boat about 10 miles west on the reservoir to the confluence of the Little Missouri River and the Missouri. So at the point where the Little Missouri empties into the Big Missouri was once this unbelievable thing. It's been inundated by this reservoir for the past 70 years, and so we can't possibly know what it looked like at the time of Lewis and Clark. We can only imagine. And though I had taken photographs of this site from every direction on land, I've never been there on water. And Brian volunteered to take us there, and it was an extraordinary day, a perfect North Dakota summer day. When we got to the exact confluence, it turned out to be 104 feet deep there. We took lots of pictures and some video, and I'll be writing about it, so you'll see more about that. It's an important moment for Lewis and Clark studies because this was one of the big events in the spring of 1805 when they left Fort Mandan into what they took to be terra incognita. And so this helps me as a Lewis and Clark scholar, as a Lewis scholar, and as a patriotic North Dakotan, because I've now seen for myself something of really significant importance to me, and I think to Lewis and Clark studies. So stay tuned for all of that. At any rate, this is quite a time in my life. I'm having an extraordinary summer. I've been at Jack Kerouac's grave. I've been at Big Bone Lick, Kentucky, where Jefferson got his mastodon bones. I've been to the National Baseball Hall of Fame. I've been to Wounded Knee in South Dakota. I've been throughout Wyoming to where the Teapot Dome scandal was centered, and to the Fetterman fight, and to the Wagon Box fight, and to Laramie, and then on to Vail. I've been to the source of the Mississippi River at Lake Itasca in Minnesota. I've been to Pipestone, South Dakota, where a red clay pipe material is so important to Native Americans that it has been kind of a peace zone, a demilitarized zone for hundreds of years. And tribes that are traditionally enemies or in struggle with each other put down their weapons when they get to Pipestone, and everyone's free to quarry this amazing material. It's been an amazing summer, and we're really only getting started here. So stay tuned and help us if you can. We need money to make this work. It's not an inexpensive thing. And again, as you know, I take none from this. All the income is psychic, and my goodness, it's huge. But come the 4th of July, I'm going to get the Airstream out of storage, spend a day getting all the systems working, and then on the 5th of July, I will be off on Steinbeck Phase 2, and the first night I will spend in the Badlands of North Dakota, out on the western edge of the state, in fact in Beach, North Dakota, where Steinbeck himself stayed on the night of October 12th, 1960. So buckle up, everyone. You're joining me on the road. I couldn't be more excited. Let's go to this program, Richard Rhodes on violence in America. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this special edition of Listening to America. I have the honor today of doing a second conversation with one of the historians that I have the greatest respect for, Richard Rhodes, the author of 28 books, including perhaps most famously The Making of the Atomic Bomb. But that's only one small part of his work. He has recently written a book on energy, A Human History. He wrote a biography of Audubon. He wrote Dark Sun, which is about the hydrogen bomb, a book on how to write. Amazing. And in addition, a book on the SS, Masters of Death, the origins of the Holocaust, a novel about the Donner Party, a life of Hedy Lamarr, of all people, and a biography of E.O. Wilson. And that's the short list. Welcome, Richard Rhodes.
Thank you very much. Good to see you again.
How do you do it? I mean, I know people who've written 3 books and written 7 books, and there was Isaac Asimov who wrote 1 million books, but how have you sustained your creative energy over all this time?
You know, first of all, writing books is ultimately a question of how can you support yourself while you do it. And I've been honest, since The Making of the Atomic Bomb won a Pulitzer Prize, I've had the support of a marvelous foundation in New York, the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, to write books of the intersection between science and technology and our life in the world. So without that, I'm not sure I could have written many books. It's very tough to be a writer in America today. The average income from writing in America is down to about $10,000 a year.
And that's for the people who are successful.
Well, $10,000 a year, they're all teaching for a living, actually, and writing on the side. I'm lucky enough to be able to write full time. So in that sense, I've been able to continue writing because I've had support to do so. But writing is like, every book is like doing a PhD without the fear, if you will. There's always anxiety because you're writing something you don't know about at the outset. But it's a great challenge and it's a great education. I have felt all my life that every time I write a book, I'm learning more. I've never understood the people who write on the same subject all their lives. I don't know how they do that. I would get bored, I think, rather rapidly. There is a subject, however, which is central to most of my books, and that is violence. American violence, human violence, the larger violence in the world, atomic weapons, and the Einsatzgruppen, who were the perpetrators of the so-called bullet holocaust. And that's because I think my childhood was interrupted by a period of considerable violence at the hands of a stepmother right out of the Grimm's fairy tales, so that I ended up my adolescence at a boys' home, a wonderful place, a farm. But even there, one is involved with the violence of killing animals for food. So it's perplexed me, let's call it that. And therefore, in all its variety, it has been a consistent theme in the books I've written.
So let me back up and just say that I reread one of your early books, Looking for America, and contacted you. You were gracious enough to agree to do a series of interviews. And my theme is America preparing for its 250th birthday, which occurs on July 4th, 2026. And I believe you will be 89 years old that day.
It's my birthday. Yeah. One of my lucky breaks as a child to have bright red hair and be born on the 4th of July was a great advantage, socially speaking.
You've gotten fireworks every birthday that you've ever gone through. You're one of the most fortunate people in America.
When I was a little boy, I thought they were for me.
Oh, they are.
Took me a while to understand we were also celebrating America's founding. So
as we think about the 4th of July, 2026, you mentioned violence, and that's our theme today. By any standard, the United States is a violent country. A phenomenon that's really just occurred in the last few years is the weekly mass shooting somewhere in America, to the point, Richard, that it's no longer front page news. Now it's fourth page news or eighth page news because it's become numbingly so common that it can't any longer sustain the sensational aspect that it had in the beginning. And foreigners, when they look at America or think of coming here, actually do have a debate about whether it is a wise thing to come to a country that is so addicted to gun violence as the United States. And when I hear that, and I know such people, we've had these conversations, it's deeply upsetting and depressing to think that the United States of America is now known, of course, as a land of opportunity and a land of great technological innovation and, the Hollywood and our soft power and so on, but also as a nation that is addicted to violence and doesn't seem to have the will to deal with it.
And in what you just said, there's a great deal of truth, but also one misconception. The United States is actually one of the less violent countries in the world, but it's more violent than Europe in particular. So I looked up the numbers. Violence is homicide, the only really reliable thing you could look at cross-culturally, because different countries have different rules about what kind of crimes they have. So homicide is one crime where everyone has a number they can look at. And it's usually expressed as number of deaths per 100,000, so that you can compare them across different populations. And the United States' homicide per 100,000 prior to the pandemic was only 5.4 deaths per 100,000, compared to Europe, where generally speaking in Western Europe, the homicide rate is much lower. It's about it for many countries was around 1 per 100,000. It's gone up slightly with the influx of immigrants from parts of the world where homicide rates are higher. So it's up to about 1.5 across Europe now. Well, I was curious, if you take out guns, which are pretty much not available in Western Europe, if you remove guns from our homicide rate, gun deaths, what's left? And before the pandemic, we were still at about 3.5 per 100,000, which is more than double what it is in Europe, which meant to me that there was something more going on here than simply the presence of guns. Now, guns facilitate violence. Whatever else people feel about guns, the fact is people who want to commit a violent act have an easier time when they can get their hands on a gun than if they have to use a knife or their hands or a club. And obviously, in the case of school shooters, they can do a lot more damage a lot more quickly than they ever could with a knife or whatever. Once in a while in Japan, there's a mass killing with someone using a knife, and the numbers don't go that high. They go up maybe to 10 or something, which is horrible. But it's so the question then to me was, what makes up that difference that has nothing to do with guns? So I looked at, just before our program, I looked at today's homicide rate in the United States, and it's gone up a bit since the pandemic. It went way up with the pandemic because, I presume, because people were all home together and had occasion to get into fights with each other. And if they were violent people, then they tended to use violence. But it's gone down a bit since then, but it's actually up now to 6.3. And that is probably neither here nor there. A lot of this kind of homicide comes from drug groups fighting each other over territory and so forth. But I looked in at Europe. I looked in at what our rate would be if you remove the gun deaths. And we're down to 1.5. We're sort of like where Europe would be. So gun deaths have become the significant difference between the homicide rate in Western Europe, where guns are basically under control and not allowed, and homicide deaths here. I find that very interesting because it points to what I understand to be the way people become violent. It's not mental illness, despite the efforts of the medical profession to medicalize violence. The people who have mental illness don't use violence at any higher rates than people who aren't judged mentally ill. So the only time you have people with mental problems showing higher rates of homicide is when they use street drugs. And there, I think one can understand that they're putting themselves in a more dangerous situation and act accordingly. So mental illness is not the cause of violence. Mental illness has its own problems. That's not one of the the use of violence, learning to be violent. And people do learn to be violent. They're not born violent. We're all born innocent, fortunately. Unfortunately, we don't get to stay that way, but we're born that way. People learn to be violent through a socialization process. Socialization is the process whereby someone has his identity changed in the process of becoming, how can I say this? Becoming whatever it is he's trying to become. If you want to be a doctor, you don't only go to school. You don't only do an internship. You're also put down and mistreated to a degree, ridiculed as incompetent while you're going through your training to break down your previous identity, and then rewarded for behaving like a doctor is supposed to behave by the doctors who are training you until you learn to behave and to think and to identify yourself as someone who is a doctor or a lawyer. Any specialty field has its process. The most classic one and the most similar to the private one I'm talking about is becoming a combat soldier. The way soldiers are conditioned, socialized to be combatants is almost identical to the way it's done privately and off the books, as it were, when someone is socialized to be violent in a private context. a school shooter, for example. They go through a period of being brutalized by someone who is credibly violent in their life. They go through a period of immense emotional turmoil as they try to find a way to cease being mistreated. The person or other people who are credibly violent coach them that violence is the answer to their problems. Every one of us at some time or another has probably told a kid, don't let that bully push you around. Next time that bully, violent people will typically say, don't let that bully push you around. The next time they attack you, pick up a brick and hit them in the head. It's that kind of coaching that leads the person who's trying to find a way out of the dilemma of being a victim to decide to try violence as a solution to the problem.
We need to take a short break. I'm talking with the eminent author and historian Richard Rhodes. Today, as we think about America 250, we're talking about violence in America. You're listening to a special edition of Listening to America. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to Listening to America. I'm with Richard Rhodes. I remember reading The Making of the Atomic Bomb, a long time ago, published in the 80s, and I was swept away by the depth of mastery of somewhat arcane information, including physics, quantum mechanics, and the dizzying number of people who were involved in that, and the different states that were involved. There were German emigres and others from Europe. The British had been ahead of us in creating the philosophy or the mechanism of the atomic weapon. Then you have these incredible human beings like Edward Teller and Robert Oppenheimer and Leslie Groves and Richard Feynman. An amazing book. And if you had done nothing but that, that would be cementing your reputation as an American writer. You won the Pulitzer Prize, and of course you richly deserved it. But then when you look at the rest of your achievement, Richard, it's stunning. Of course, it fills any other writer with a kind of envy. You look in the mirror and think, what's wrong with me that this guy can do this well, this often with so many different sorts of books, and you're still writing, which is amazing to me because you no longer need to. You know, Samuel Johnson said, no one but a blockhead writes but for money. But you write now because it's a habit. Have you ever reached a point where you had a sustained writer's block, where for months you just couldn't do it?
Not of that kind. I really had that before I started. I was so full of rage and anger about my childhood when I went through a period of serious child abuse that I was afraid if I let the feelings out, I would blow up the world. Speaking of the atomic bomb. I went into psychotherapy with a good man from Menninger's, and it was about 8 months into that I started eating and started writing. I had so much anxiety all the time. I was underweight. I weighed about 130 pounds, and I'm almost 6 feet tall.
My goodness.
So,
like Oppenheimer, he was like at 125 when the atomic bomb went up at Alamogordo.
Yes, Oppenheimer. Yes, he just had chickenpox, so he really lost.
So let me ask you a really personal question, Richard, and you don't have to answer it if you don't want to, but your difficult upbringing, really terribly difficult, abusive upbringing, would have made you a candidate for a violent life.
Yeah, well, that's very interesting because I had an older brother, a year and a half older than I, who really protected me as a child. I did not have to go through the same degree of violence as he did, for example. But we were talking earlier about how you become violent. And there's something that's called a violent personal revolt, which happens when someone who has been dominated and abused by violent people in his life or her life, more often males. Women, I think, are often diverted towards sexuality rather than violence. In any case, when he reaches the point where he realizes he has a choice he has to make. Either he's going to spend the rest of his life being violently dominated by other people, and this is what the coach tells him as well, or he's going to learn to use serious violence himself. And the violent personal revolt is one version of the first time this person tries serious violence, typically in adolescence. The revolt is toward the person who is currently dominating and violently trying to dominate them. And it has a classic form. It's the worm turns, as it were. Suddenly I'll give you a classic example, and that's Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton's mother was being abused by Clinton's stepfather, and I presume Clinton was too. He usually focuses the story on his mother's problem. But at a certain point, Clinton was big enough that he turned to his stepfather and said, okay, that's it, no more. You keep this up, I'm going to beat them out of you. And the guy backed off. So he really, whether there was a physical altercation, I don't know. But this is typically the kind of thing that happens with the school shooter who first kills his parents and then goes to school and does something else that's characteristic about learning to be violent and socializing to become a violent person. And that is, discovers the immense power that one feels that the criminologist whose work I'm describing to you calls violent notoriety. When you use serious violence, people change their behavior toward you from being someone whom other people ignored or bullied or in other ways showed contempt toward. You suddenly become someone whom everyone pays attention to because they're afraid of you and give you space and give you respect. So violent notoriety, when I hear newscasters say, we'll never know the reason why that kid did that, I always wince because the reason is self-evident. They did it because they wanted to be known, as many of the school shooters have said, either before or after. I wanted people to know me. I didn't want to just disappear in the world.
We know the name Lee Harvey Oswald, don't we? We know the name John Wilkes Booth, don't we?
Yeah, exactly. So every time I hear someone say, we don't know the reason that kid did that, the motive is very clear. There may be other motives as well. And of course, you often find those. Oswald was interestingly focused on political violence uniquely. And I trace his development as a violent human being in one of my books, showing how his particular focus on political violence originated. And I won't go into all that history, but it's in that book for anyone who's curious.
I want to go back to something you said in the first segment. You said that we are not born violent, that we're born innocent. So you sound like a Lockean, that we're born with a tabula rasa and we become the stimuli and the pressures on us and the training and the guiding and the coaching of our lives. You know, some people, Konrad Lorenz, for example, have said, no, that's true, of course, but there's also a kind of a dark gene that evolutionarily we were able to survive because we're vicious primates too, when necessary. Are you doubting that?
No, we have those qualities and skills and musculature and all those good things and brain. We're evolved to be capable of using serious violence, of course, but that doesn't mean we necessarily do. The history of violence in the West, which is really fascinating and much neglected. If you go back to medieval Europe, you find that homicide rates, to the best that they can be determined, and again, because it's homicide, they kept good numbers, and especially because homicide was a crime of treason against the king. So the king got to keep all the goods that evolved from a homicide. So they kept very good records for the king. The homicide rate in medieval England was around 15 to 20 per 100,000. That's like our worst inner cities today. It was a violent world, and it was a violent world for a very interesting reason. You had to deal with resolving your disputes on your own. There was no central authority that took that over yet. That would come in the early modern era. And you can trace the decline in violence in the West with the centralization of government, with the development of specialized, most of all with access to courts of law. That was the big breakthrough. Rather than go out and beat someone in the head with a stick, you could go to court and adjudicate your disputes. That is where the change really came. And it came about because with the rise of the middle class people didn't want to have to spend all the time watching their backs. They wanted to make deals and make money. And their exchange to the king for paying their taxes was that he came up with some way to deal with the violence in the world. Imagine a modern corporation. Imagine a modern corporation if everyone was a seriously violent person. Bodies would be flying out the windows. I mean, it would be a different world. So there had to be some way to get this under control. And the king, in exchange for collecting taxes.
So the king, Louis XIV, the idea that Versailles had to be a kind of a demilitarized zone in order to do what it did, and people made that rational calculation. If I want to do business with the crown, I'm going to have to leave my crossbow or whatever it might be at the gate. I think of Beccaria in Italy, the Enlightenment philosopher of crime and punishment, who was doing exactly what you're saying, trying to create a system in which there would be a due process where there would be represented by counsel, that evidence would have to be presented. And his view was that the only way to stop all of this was to have swift, rational, consistent process, and that would bring down the private violence rate. And so the Enlightenment was part of this too. And Thomas Jefferson equally believed in all of this, that this is something that the United States picked up immediately from the Enlightenment. And then when Tocqueville came here in 1832, he came to study the American penal system because he thought it was the most innovative in the world at the time. He went on to do much, much more. But you see how these streams are moving together towards modernity.
Right, exactly. By the time we get to post-World War II, we're talking about homicide rates below 10 per 100,000 in the United States. And it has fluctuated ever since, primarily according to gang wars, drug context. When you're doing black market drugs, obviously it's a dangerous profession and it has to be protected. You have to protect your turf and so forth. When you're dealing with inner cities where the police basically stay out and you don't have much access to courts because you're poor.
Or on Indian reservations in America today, where there is an insufficient infrastructure of due process, so vendetta killings and private responses to oppressive or hateful circumstances lead to violence in a way that they wouldn't necessarily if there were an intact system of due process.
Exactly. So once again, the kind of crimes that are left in the United States are largely these, and the reason we think our country is so violent is really because there are these mass shootings, which are shocking, as you say, not as shocking as they used to be because they now happen almost every day somewhere in the United States. But it's interesting that it's come down to that because if you're, let's say, a 14-year-old and you're getting bullied at school all the time and maybe you're getting abused by your parents or whatever, I could go into the individual shooting cases and give you backgrounds like Klebold and Harris in Columbine, whom everyone said they had nice parents, so fit the model. And it turns out that Harris's father was an Air Force officer, and Harris was bullied on the air bases where they lived. And Klebold's older brother was a football player, and he and his pals used to beat up on Klebold all the time.
This is the famous Columbine case, which was really the case that spiked national attention to school shootings.
And of course, school shootings for someone who wants violent notoriety are just a dream situation. If you can get your hands on a repeating rifle of some kind and go in and kill a bunch of people, you're going to be famous. Even in the case of those who then end their shooting spree by suicide, they've still done what they dreamed of doing, which is to become famous, to be known. Klebold and Harris were planning to hijack a plane, fly it into the Pentagon or the White House. They had these vast dreams of glory about how they were going to show the world who they really were. That kind of thing is there in the background, but it's facilitated by access to a lethal weapon. And that, I think, is the reason why gun violence is an issue. Not because I know this is a very fraught question for people, and I'm not talking about people with hunting and so forth. I am saying that if you're not, let's say, physically strong enough to beat up your parents or the bully who's dominating you all the time, you are immensely increased in your violence ability by having a gun. So people who would otherwise probably go through this process at much greater risk to themselves in fact, have the chance to do major damage without it. That's not to say it does without it, but guns are a very significant part.
It's something that Thomas Jefferson recognized even in the 18th century. You know, he has a letter in which he says, he's talking to John Adams about the aristoi, the most powerful people in any society. He said in the old days, it was the tallest, the strongest, the richest, the person with the greatest amount of power. But he says now, thanks to gunpowder, and I'm using this term as a quotation, he says, any shrimp can kill anybody. So he uses shrimp. Of course, this is way before the kind of violence we think about in our cities now. But you know, he's right that guns are the great equalizer. So it's the ubiquity of access to guns. I mean, these young people you're talking about who are 18, 19 years old, they broke up with their girlfriend or they were bullied at home, something went wrong, and somehow they get an AR-15. Either their parents allowed them to have it or they find another means. And now suddenly they're not going into the school bully to do fisticuffs. Now they simply get away. You can shoot an AR-15 from a long distance and do unbelievable damage to the other. But here's a question for you. Once I shoot my father or the principal or whoever it is, it seems to release a chain of violence that it doesn't end there. It's not like, okay, I put down my gun, go back to my life. It seems to invite a greater sense of retribution, often against totally innocent people.
Well, again, I think that's the violent notoriety. I think I want people to know how immensely powerful I am, in fact. And the way to do that is to lay down a bunch of bodies. And, I've heard enough from people who were seriously violent and have used weapons, including the military, to know what an incredible rush it is to shoot things. I remember afternoons as a young adult going out with a .22 rifle to a junkyard and shooting glass bottles all afternoon. I mean, I and my friend didn't want to stop. It was just such fun seeing things blow up all over the yard with this little .22 rifle. It's a rush. It is. And I can see how that could combine with one of Dr. Althons's points about this process is when you do this turn and try violence, if you're successful with it, if it solves the problem for you, in the immediate situation, if the bully stops bullying you, if he dies and therefore stops bullying you, whatever, then there is an enormous feeling of transformation that is almost impossible to resist to someone who thinks of himself as a violent human being. The difference between our soldiers are conditioned, are socialized to be violent defensively only. And there's a whole structure of military law, of codes of conduct, of codes of honor against using violence offensively against people who aren't threatening you. And that, of course, is criminal violence. It's criminal violence in the military, too. It's criminal violence. Look at what's happening with the Israelis and their bombings, where they're causing a lot of, quote, collateral damage to civilians. Everyone is upset by this, and properly so. That's offensive violence, whatever they frame it as. And look also that they're framing it as collateral damage, unintended consequences. When I wanted to test this model, and I deeply believe that this is a universal model of how people become violent. When I wanted to test it, I decided to try to find a context as different from. Athens developed this model by interviewing about 50 violent criminals in prisons over a series of years for about 10 hours each, really get deeply into their whole history of violence as far back as they could remember it, and then look for what they all had in common. This is the process whereby medical breakthroughs are made. You look for people who have the disease, and then you try to see what they all have in common that's related to that situation. And it doesn't take matched millions of samples on both sides. This is not a correlational process. This is a causal process. It is tested every time you look at a new case, and you don't always have all the things put together. When malaria was first identified based on one case, because the doctor found the malarial parasite swarming in the blood of one of his patients. That was the cause. But then there were a few patients who showed up with no malarial parasites in the blood, and he had to revise his model. And what then was discovered was that the parasite sometimes stays in the liver for periods of rest, as it were, before it comes back into the blood. So this process, which is basically the way medical breakthroughs movies are made, was what Athens used to identify the model for how people become violent. And soldiers are deliberately kept at stage 3. I decided to find a place where there was mass killing of innocent people, and I settled on the SS Einsatzgruppen. These were the special forces, that's what Einsatzgruppen means, who followed behind the German army when it went into the Soviet Union.
Yeah, so I got to stop you there because we need to take a break, Richard. And of course, the other way to do this is to create a factory model of killing mass numbers of people using sort of the industrial paradigm that's emerging in the 19th and 20th century. And that produces an even more chilling horror of a certain sort. We got to take a break. We'll be back in just a moment. And I know you have more to say about this. I'm talking with Richard Rhodes, the author of 28 books, more coming. We're talking about violence, and particularly violence in America. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to this special edition of Listening to America. Richard Rhodes, the prolific author, my friend, a great writer in addition to being an important historian. You were talking about the SS. I went to Rome a number of times in the last few years, and there was a famous incident where some Roman resistors shot some Nazi occupiers, and the Nazis did that sort of 10-to-1 retribution thing and had people gathered up in a cave in Rome and just told the special forces, just, shoot them, just kill them all. And I remember reading that many of the soldiers had to drink almost unbelievable amounts of brandy just to be able to do it, that even people that had been propagandized into being killers and who believed that other peoples were subordinate or subhuman found it impossible to make the leap from defensive killing or killing in a just war to the kind of mayhem and slaughter that they were suddenly faced.
Yes, this was true in spades with the Einsatzgruppen because they were killing people in large numbers every day. Local police would round up an entire village of Jews, men, women, and children, starting in the summer of 41, and take them out to the edge of town, and they would be shot into a pit that had been dug for them, and then the pit covered up. And I visited these mounds all over Europe, starting in Lithuania and moving down to Ukraine when I was writing this book. Many of them never marked in any way, just a little grassy mound out in the forest on the edge of town. It was shocking to walk through forest floor covered with feuilles de bois with wild strawberries, and then here is this mound. My point is, these soldiers, as all soldiers are, had been conditioned to the level of defensive violence by having their heads shaved, being called whatever they're called by their drill sergeant, and given all sorts of hard work and drill to do, but slowly awarded honor as they learn to fire their weapons, as they learn to think of themselves as soldiers.
The usual narrative is that we've been a violent country from the beginning. We were born in revolution. We had the frontier, which we had to kill varmints, but also to dispossess native peoples using great violence when necessary. One thesis is that the difference between the United States and Canada, among others, is that in Canada, the Mounties got to the West as the settlers did, but in America, the settlers got there before the law. And so you have vigilance committees and posses and hangings and lynchings and so on. So the usual theme, Richard, is that violence is sort of embedded in the American culture from the beginning, and so it's not surprising that violence continues to be an option in a nation that celebrates it in movies and television and video games and so on, and that if we reconfigured our software to stop celebrating violence, it would have an ameliorative effect. What do you say?
Japan has the lowest homicide rate in the world. It's like 0.2%. They also have some of the most violent movies and violent cultural phenomena. The whole belief that somehow people can become violent by watching television is, it's just ludicrous. Think about what someone, as I described this socialization process, has to go through to become seriously violent. They have to put their lives on the line. They have to confront the bully who's been dominating them. They have to confront the others who are dominating them in school. That means they have to take the risk of serious injury themselves, even death. That you don't do that by watching television. Athens found 4 different reasons why people use violence. A couple of those are, yes, anger, but another one is frustration, which, for example, is someone has something you want and they won't give it to you. That's a frustration. There are other kinds as well. There is the ultimate one, which is just pure hatred. And that shows up particularly in racial violence, where people hate someone because they're a different color or whatever. So, and sometimes these things get combined in various ways. But the fact is, if you think about someone who uses violence in the context of, let's say, family domestic abuse, that may well be triggered by anger, but it's probably more often triggered by frustration or some combination of the two. But if you think about a drug dealer in the ordinary course of business using violence, they're probably not angry about it. They're probably perhaps frustrated about it. They may hate someone because they don't like the way they look or whatever. But there are lots of different reasons. Plus, people make decisions always before they use violence. They don't snap. That's a strange idea that we're sort of, I don't know, some kind of bug that can fly quickly into the air and snap. Well, people don't snap. They make a decision. Sometimes with people who are comfortable using violence, the decision is very fast. And the reason Athens found that to be true is because a lot of the violent criminals he interviewed talked about having decided not to use violence in a context. As the police like to say, there are very few homicides committed in the presence of a uniformed police officer.
And the overwhelming majority of the American people would like some reasonable, intelligent, sensible gun restraint, rigorous background checks, closing the loopholes, preventing bump stocks and other accelerators. Almost nobody in America wants to take away your hunting rifle or the pistol you use at the range, and yet the NRA and its advocates go straight to the most alarmist sort of thing and say, well, the first thing Hitler did was take away everybody's guns, and you've read all this rhetoric all of your life. The average person with a gun is a responsible person. I'm a North Dakotan. It used to be, Richard, that every young male North Dakotan took gun safety, learned how to hunt, learned how to use guns responsibly, learned how to put them in the right places between uses of them, kept ammunition away, prevented children from having access to them. You know, most gun owners are perfectly reasonable, responsible human beings, and that includes hunting too, of course. But we need reasonable gun restraints, and there's a solid majority, almost a super majority in America that wants that, and yet we can't get there. So that, of course, takes us to the paralysis of Americans in Congress, the paralysis of our political system.
Yeah, and most of all, I think it takes us to the baleful influence of the gun industry on its irresponsible effort to eliminate all possible controls. You know, we require people to learn to drive safely. There's almost no context I can think of where there's the use of dangerous equipment of one kind or another, where you don't have to be licensed and trained and so forth. I think the real tragedy isn't the question of gun ownership as such. I'm absolutely in agreement with you about that. It's rather that there's as simple a thing as having to get insurance, the way we do with our cars, which are certainly lethal weapons potentially, would make a great deal of sense. And similarly, I think a period of training, just to know how to use this weapon, how to take care of it, what to do with it, how to keep it safe, and all those things. There would still be occasional, of course, gun-related crime and probably school shooters and so forth, but the numbers would go down. What's the bare minimum? I don't know. Japan is probably the country that has the best evidence for how, but they have very strict gun control. It's very difficult to get a license to own a weapon in Japan. And I don't know that that's appropriate to this country, but we can certainly do all of the damage minimizing safety things that we do with other lethal objects. I don't know why we don't.
My friend Marzio, who's an Italian journalist, and I had a conversation about this not so long ago after one of the many, many, many school shootings in America. And I said, Marzio, he lives in Milan, if you wanted to get an AR-15, how would you go about it? And he said, well, first of all, I'd have to be interviewed at least twice in long, serious interviews. There would be waiting periods of many months. There would be a psychological profile made of me. I would have to find a way to justify the need for such a thing. And I said, but if you got through all of that, could you get one? And he said, yeah, but it would cost thousands of euros. In other words, he's not going to be able to get an AR-15. I said, well, how many mass shootings are there in Italy per annum? And he said, duh, none, or, one every decade. And so you think the Second Amendment should not be a suicide pact. We're a very civilized, advanced country with some of the best universities in the world, some of the greatest sociologists and psychologists. We have brilliant historians like yourself who've looked into this and can give us evidence instead of just, ideas or perspectives. No, why can't we as an enlightened people face up to this and find some middle ground between the absolutism of the Second Amendment types and the desperate social need to get on top of this thing?
One of the things that the guys who want to carry weapons around all the time, and one sees pictures of people carrying their AR-15 into the donut shop.
Or the Michigan legislature.
Oh, yes, or the legislature or church or whatever. Those guys are somewhere in the middle of this violent socialization process, in my mind. The very fact that they're carrying a lethal weapon tells me that they're somewhere on the grade in terms of becoming violent, at least defensively. But that's basically a kind of a fake violent notoriety, in fact. And I think it speaks more, and I hate to say this to your listeners, but to me it speaks more of cowardice than it does of virtue. It's like, I've got a weapon and therefore you better watch out for me. Is this person actually willing to use this weapon? If they are, should they be on the streets? It's a complicated question. I don't have a problem with people having weapons. I just have a problem with weapons being basically out of control.
All right, now let me turn to the big issue of our time, Richard, of this time. So the election is coming on the first week in November. We've reached a point where millions of people believe that the system is rigged. In other words, that there isn't a decent and fair arbitrator to determine whether the election is honest or stolen. They no longer have respect for the system that we all thought would adjudicate such things. And so they say, because the system doesn't really allow the fairness that I insist upon, I'm going to go to extra constitutional means to make sure that my guy is not denied his office. This happened on January 6th. Assuming that the election is close, assuming that Joe Biden wins, which I don't think anyone can assume, I expect there will be street violence because of this very issue, that if there's nowhere to turn for a fair adjudication, an umpire that you can really trust, then maybe, as a Nevada senator put it, you need to take Second Amendment options.
Well, yes, I agree with you. I think the risk is very high. I think whoever's elected, unless there's a very clear victory for Donald Trump, assuming that he's finally the candidate, there's going to be some kind of breakout. But thank God in this country at this point in time, our military is still very strongly committed to supporting constitutional means. I think that development followed from the Vietnam War, and it's one of the grand changes that's come in American life. God bless them.
If you were in charge of the universe, we talk about red flag laws, and you've said that there's kind of a wrong-headed myth of the mentally unstable and so on, the mentally ill. What would you do looking around a school or looking around a mall or looking around a parade or looking around a mass event of some sort to recognize the people that are probably being bullied or being oppressed, being frustrated? In other words, what kind of a monitoring system would you want us to devise in order to get on top of this thing?
The beauty of Lonnie Athens' model of violent socialization is that it's quite a complicated process to become seriously violent. Thank God. I'm glad it's not easy. So at every stage along the way, there are possibilities for interventions, and they are interventions broadly social that could change this country in that regard. So many of them are already in place, actually. For example, there was a program in New Hampshire to send home visitors, nurses typically, into a home with a new baby to help the mother learn how to take care of the baby. But at the same time, to encourage and teach the mothers and fathers that if a baby's crying, it's not being willful and shouldn't be smacked. It maybe needs its diaper changed. Admissions to hospital emergency room for intentionally inflicted wounds of infants dropped enormously in this particular study in New Hampshire. So that was one piece. That was the first piece. But around the age of 4, when the nursing program pulled out and parents were once again on their own, the hospital admissions started to go up again. So then the question was, what do you do with the next group, from the school age group, let's say up to high school? And the answer was that Vermont, New Hampshire, I think in this case, developed family-oriented community centers. They had outreach. These are communities that are kind of spread out. They're largely rural up there. So they had people visiting homes. But more to the point, there were all sorts of programs, benevolent programs that people could come to at a community center. There were talking groups and therapy groups, and all of the state's various social welfare programs had representatives there. Recreation for the kids, basketball, whatever, all of this to help pull people in and give them a place where they could learn to relate to each other. The focus had been on reducing teenage pregnancies. Teenage pregnancies dropped to about 5% from like 20 or 30 before. A dramatic change, basically just by, of course, teaching people to use contraception and all the things you do. The next piece was anti-bullying programs in schools, something the Menninger Foundation started some years ago very successfully. Basically, a whole class was made responsible for any acts of bullying that were going on. And there were flags that they got to fly if they'd had none of this going on for one whole month. The whole school became involved. Instead of just saying, shut up over there, when someone's hitting someone, the teacher would stop the whole class and say, class, we're having a problem here. Let's talk about it. Let's deal with it. This worked beautifully and reduced bullying enormously. So each step of the way. There's even a program in Chicago right now where former violent felons have been trained and are paid to go out into the community and defuse potentially violent confrontations. And that works too, even when people are already violent. Because again, as I said before, people actually think about when they're going to be violent.
Richard, let me put one more possibility on the table. One way we came to terms with the lethality of the tobacco industry was to allow people to sue the tobacco industry, and it worked. We should allow people to sue the ammunition industry and the gun industry, shouldn't we?
Well, yes, I totally agree. But we're so conflicted politically on those issues. These are another way, something like what we do in America to deal with helping people not develop heart disease. It's broad. It doesn't reach everyone. There's still kids who are going to get beat up at home all the time. That's going to happen. But generally speaking, for a broad population, these are proven. Every one of these was tested in research, proven to work as ways of reducing specific problems, but in a broader way, they're reducing violent socialization.
So Richard Rhodes, let me see if I've got this right. These are some of my takeaways. We're out of time, unfortunately. Number one, America is not uniquely violent, but America's violence is exacerbated greatly by the ubiquity of access to guns in America. That's one thing you're saying. Number two, you're saying that there are ways to address this that don't require us to go to the mat on the Second Amendment or to find legislation that can get through Congress. There are other things that we can do, and they work. They've worked in different places around the country. Those two things seem to me to be very hopeful. And it seems to me that communities will inevitably come to these things, and some already are, because we can't sustain this level of mayhem in this civilization any longer. So thank you for your wisdom. Is there a book we should read?
Why They Kill.
Your book,
It's
Why
my
They
book.
Kill. I will put that up. So I'm looking forward to our next conversations. Do you have a topic in mind, sir?
Actually, I do.
What is
It's
it?
the urban-rural conflict in this country.
That's what I was going to propose, that we talk about the future of rural America and so on. So let's do that. But meanwhile, I have to say this. Thank you, Richard Rhodes. It is a distinct honor and pleasure to have these conversations with you. And for the rest of you, we'll see you next week for another important edition of Listening to America.